This footage shows an elderly Queen Victoria at the peak of her popularity. Within her immensely long lifespan, Britain had become the world's leading industrial and imperial superpower. And while monarchies across the continent disappeared under waves of revolutions, somehow she'd survived. I believe it was music that helped Victoria to reshape the monarchy. By her reign, it had lost its cold, hard power, but she turned it into a sort of benevolent cultural force, with a popular appeal more potent than party politics. And her great romance with Prince Albert was defined by a shared passion for music. Their love helped Britain become an elite centre of musical excellence. Together, they set the stage for a new generation of great British composers. Victoria and Albert helped to transform our musical landscape. They set up institutions like the Royal College of Music and the Albert Hall that kicked off something of an English musical renaissance. It saw homegrown composers working to define our nation's music. This is Queen Victoria's musical Britain. And contrary to what you might be thinking, she was very much amused. Victoria's early years were lonely. She was brought up behind closed doors, being prepared in private to inherit a very unpopular monarchy. What she needed was some good PR. So in 1835, she was sent on a publicity tour of the nation, which proved to be quite a musical awakening. If the Britain of Victoria's ancestors had a theme tune, this would be it. The Messiah was the German composer's most magnificent work. But to be honest, the teenage princess found it rather boring and old-fashioned to listen to. Clearly, she was going to be a fresh start for the monarchy. And for its music, too. Victoria recorded her life in her journals, and using these, it's possible to reveal just how important music was to her.
With the exception of a few choruses and one or two songs, it was very heavy and tiresome. I am not at all fond of Handel's music. I am a terribly modern person. And I must say, I prefer Bellini, Rossini and Donizetti to anything else.
In the 1830s, these three Italian composers were revolutionising opera. The stories they told were explosive, full of emotion, larger-than-life characters and epic music. It was only here that Victoria could taste the violent emotions she longed to experience for real. The Italian opera was absolutely the place to be. The Princess Victoria loved coming to the Italian opera. Sometimes she'd come as often as 3 times a week. And in her journal, she'd often give rave reviews to the performances she'd seen. Sometimes she said that she'd been very much amused. Sometimes very, very much amused, underlined twice, and sometimes even very, very much amused indeed, with 3 underlinings. For poor, lonely little Victoria, a visit to the opera was an escape from her boring and isolated life at home. To her, the opera was like a window into a more glamorous world. This new brand of Italian opera turned its singers into stars. They became mega celebrities. Victoria filled volume after volume of her sketchbooks with portraits of her favourites. This fantastic sketch shows two of the brightest of them. Victoria probably did it from memory, the day after having seen a performance. This is Luigi Lablache, as the stern chief of the Druids. And this lady, pitifully kissing his hand, is Giulia Grisi. The whole book is full of images of these two. I think that Victoria was their biggest fan. While it was claustrophobic, life at Kensington Palace wasn't all bad. When she turned 16, Victoria's mother threw her a party most young girls could only dream of. Her idols, including Giulia Grisi, were invited to sing for her here in her very own home. This was a revelation to a girl who was soon going to be a queen. As monarch, she'd have the power of command over her subjects, and she'd be able to summon her musical heroes to come to the palace to play just for her. She was going to enjoy wielding this kind of power.
No one could be more enchanted than I was. I shall never forget it. It was Mamma's birthday present for me. I stayed up till 20 minutes past 1. I was most exceedingly delighted.
That brilliant concert put a new idea in Victoria's head. She begged to learn singing, but not just from any old teacher. She wanted to learn from none other than her crush, Luigi Lablache. She'd seen him sing at her birthday party with Grisi, and also as the star in her favourite opera, I Puritani. She loved his rich voice and his expressive acting. What do you think she took away from her singing lessons?
She was getting to sing with Lablache a wide range of emotional encounters. And for somebody like Victoria, who's a rather lonely adolescent with a very large future awaiting for her, these moments, this possibility of acting out other characters, other means of expressing herself through music, was a type of safe space for all sorts of different emotional experiences. In the situation she is going to be in, she's going to be similarly facing the public, facing formal engagements, having to be somebody else. And it's as if she is able to learn from Lablache how these other performers did it.
How to perform being
Yes.
a queen in due course.
Yes.
Within just one short year, the 18-year-old Victoria did become queen. And her lessons with Lablache had prepared her for this role she'd been destined to play. Now that she was finally free, she wasted no time in throwing her first state ball in her new home, Buckingham Palace. Of course, there would be the very latest music and the very latest dances. The new and scandalous dance was the waltz. Scandalous because you had to wrap your arms around your partner as you twirled them across the floor. In fact, Byron even wrote a poem about what he called the wicked waltz. All around the confines of the yielded waist, he wrote, the strangest hand may wander undisplaced. Now, obviously the Queen couldn't have strange hands wandering round her waist, so she had to sit out the waltz at the palace balls. But the fact that the waltz had been danced at Buckingham Palace did mean that it was on its way to becoming respectable. The music for Victoria's first ball was provided by Johann Strauss Sr. He even wrote a piece especially for the occasion. He and his orchestra were famous in their native Vienna, and thanks to Victoria's endorsement, they now embarked on a sell-out tour across the country. There wasn't a ballroom in Britain that wasn't filled with waltzing couples desperate to copy their fashionable young monarch. But if Victoria was going to join in this rather risque dance herself, she'd need to be married. This match would be Europe's most important in a century, planned to extend royal influence across the continent. Albert was destined since birth to be Victoria's husband. Their families had it all planned out. On paper, he looked perfect. He was the younger son of the ruler of Coburg in Germany. He had pure blood, unimpeachable morals. But Victoria was a deeply romantic person, living in a romantic age. For her to get married, she'd have to feel that she was head over heels in love. And it was on the dance floor that Albert was able to sweep her off her feet. Albert clearly had a deep musical sensibility, as indeed did Victoria herself. And this shared passion bound them together. Dancing also provided a great opportunity for Victoria to ogle at Albert's fine figure.
It is quite a pleasure to look at Albert when he gallops and waltzes. He does it so beautifully, holds himself so well with that beautiful figure of his. During dancing, I squeezed and pressed dearest Albert's hand, and he mine.
All this dancing did the trick. Just 5 days after Albert's arrival, Victoria summoned him into her private closet and told him that they were going to get married. Albert joyfully agreed. Like a pair of giddy teenagers, the 20-year-old lovers used music to express the intensity of their feelings. And what would any self-respecting, musically talented prince do when he was in love? He'd write love songs, of course. These 4 volumes contain upwards of 24 songs, or lieder, as Albert would have called them, that he wrote in just 2 years. This one here is actually in his own handwriting. It's called The Distant One, and Victoria herself has annotated it. She's written here, composed by dear Albert at Windsor Castle during the period of their engagement. So this was a courtship gift from him to her. The first line of the song reads, "Through the night I send forth my greetings." And I imagine him sitting in his own room here at Windsor Castle, composing away, the air around him crackling with emotion as he sends his thoughts down the corridor towards his fiancée. It's desperately romantic. In her journal, Victoria describes how Albert serenaded her.
He then sang to me some of his own compositions, which are beautiful, and he has a very fine voice.
This was clearly the beginning of a genuine love story, a great romance. But their marriage would turn out to be something of a power struggle. Albert would find it hard to adjust to a wife who was also the Queen. Under Albert's influence, music at court began to change. He set about organising civilised musical evenings with the entire royal household. It was out with the frothy Italian operas of Victoria's youth and in with high-minded German classical music.
Schließen sich die müden Blicke, dann erstehet Bild um Bild, und mit ihm verliebte Stunden sind, die mir der Traum enthüllt, sind, die mir der Traum enthüllt.
Albert really wanted to bring Victoria round to his way of thinking and of living. He had in mind to create a perfect, dutiful, sober royal family, by contrast to some of the more dissolute royal families of recent history, with their debauchery and mistresses and so on. And singing leader like this, well, it was the epitome of decorum and propriety. This was going to be a royal family that its subjects could look up to and emulate. It wasn't just the family's image the royal couple set about correcting. Under the rule of Victoria's uncles, opera-going had developed a terrible reputation. It was a decadent pastime for dandies who'd hang out here, interrupting performances with their drinking and pursuing of women. At the Royal Opera House, I'm meeting historian Flora Wilson.
Welcome to the Royal Box. Thank you.
To find out how Victoria was at the vanguard of a revolution in theatre manners. How did Victoria herself behave?
Well, Victoria was very much of her time in that she used this box right here as a sort of drawing room. So she would be visited by courtiers, by the sort of leading social elite of the day. She would hold court, as it were, in her box. And that was very typical. Women, generally speaking, in opera houses at that time did stay put in their boxes, and they were visited by the men from around the opera house who were mobile. But the way that Victoria was actually sort of ahead of her time was that, unlike the aristocrats around her who would chatter during performances, they would flirt, they'd gamble, they might even eat dinner during an opera performance, she would actually sit there and listen. She was the kind of etiquette manual par excellence during an era of etiquette manuals. And so the fact that she was sitting quietly and paying attention meant that the social elites, who for years in London had been famous for sort of behaving badly at the opera house, they gradually settled down and actually started listening in a way that we would now expect. It was really the beginning of modern listening.
I think what interests me is the way, right, hierarchy is breaking down, more people are getting the vote. The Queen can't rely on being the Queen anymore. She's got to find new ways to do it.
Exactly, yeah, she actually needs to lead in a kind of an active way and using culture for that, I think, and using music in particular because it was something she obviously cared so much about. In the wake of an assassination attempt on her in 1840, she came to the Opera House, was publicly, visibly available, and of course she was applauded, and the entire audience sang God Save the Queen. It was a great moment of national coming together, a really symbolic, important moment for that.
In this picture here, she looks like she's the central attraction, really. I imagine everybody would be looking at us rather than the stage.
No, absolutely. I mean, the place to sit if you weren't the Queen during a state visit was either directly above or below her, so that everyone else in the Opera House who was looking at the Queen would also see you. It was absolutely about the kind of the visual spectacle.
There was an explosion in the printed press in the 1840s. These new weeklies were obsessed with the young Queen and her handsome husband. So when the royal couple made their first trip to Scotland, whose landscapes and culture had fired their romantic imaginations, the press were hot on their heels. Every step of her progress as she went across the Highlands was watched and recorded. It says here that the editor of the book was an eyewitness of the varied and stirring scenes detailed, and the pictures come from sketches by an artist who was a constant spectator, basically a Victorian pap. This was the monarchy and the media working together because they knew, as it says here, that the British throne rests on the affections of the people. But it's also true that Victoria herself had wanted to go to Scotland for a really long time to experience the culture and to hear the music. This whole trip would lead to a sort of romanticised version of Scotland that probably had very little to do with the ordinary lives of Scots. In anticipation of Victoria and Albert's arrival here at Taymouth Castle, Highlanders and pipers arranged themselves in formation while crowds of locals gathered. Everyone was eager to catch a glimpse of the royal couple.
It was the finest sight imaginable, and seemed like the reception in olden feudal times of the sovereign by a chieftain. It was truly princely and romantic.
And the book tells us that in this magnificent Gothic hall at Taymouth Castle, she attended a ball with Scottish music and dancing. And she had a great time. It describes her vivacity and how her face was radiant with pleasure and delight. I think there's something very important in her capacity for enjoyment, for fun. It makes her human. She loved the bagpipes and the dancing and the whiskey. And this made her relatable. It made her popular in a way that Prince Albert, for all his impressive qualities, would never be. Much like Strauss and the waltz, Victoria's love of Scotland kicked off a craze across Britain for pretending to be Scottish. Ladies and gentlemen all over the British Isles clad themselves in tartan and danced reels to the dulcet tones of bagpipes. And in the wake of Victoria's trip, tourism to the Highlands boomed. Helped by Thomas Cook, who ran the first package holidays in 1846. These tartan tours were big business, and soon Scotland was flooded with visitors. Many other tourists now began to follow in Queen Victoria's footsteps to see this rugged and romantic landscape. The idealised version of Scotland that they sought would also inspire artists and writers and musicians. The German composer Felix Mendelssohn was so moved by his visit that he wrote a whole Scottish symphony. In 1842, Mendelssohn debuted his Scottish with London's Philharmonic Society. Even though Britain hadn't produced many of its own great composers, Victoria and Albert had made it an attractive place for European musicians. Reputations could be made here, and fortunes earned. Mendelssohn was welcomed by the British critics with open arms. The reviews for his new symphony were nothing short of glowing. London's Wigmore Hall is much like the old Hanover Square rooms where he made his debut. There was only one thing he needed to set the final seal on his success, and that was the approval of the Queen. After his triumphant reception, Mendelssohn was summoned to Buckingham Palace for an audience with the royals. What was the significance of Victoria allowing Mendelssohn to dedicate his Scottish symphony to her?
Well, he came to London for that very purpose in 1842 to ask her if he could dedicate this symphony, number 3, to her. She played a huge role in popularising his music in Britain. And I suppose she would then project this image of him as being a composer fit for a queen.
So we've got Mendelssohn with his brand of music and Victoria with her brand of queening, and they could each see that they had something to offer the other, and they sort of did a deal.
Absolutely.
Mendelssohn returned many times to Buckingham Palace, striking up a real understanding, almost a friendship, with Victoria and Albert. These visits often turned into impromptu jamming sessions. Victoria even sang to the great composer, one of his sister's compositions. Now, we know that playing music together, playing piano duets, was important to Victoria and Albert. What did they particularly like to play?
They played special arrangements, they played symphonies, they played absolutely anything they could, sheet music they could find, and that was an important part of their social experience. But Mendelssohn arranged one song without words, which is very beautiful, Opus 85, number 6, in 1847, for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to play together.
Well, what a treat, your favourite composer arranging a duet for you.
Absolutely, it was his last visit in London, actually, and he sent it with a note of appreciation to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert.
So is it possible that Victoria and Albert played this piece of music in this very room, on this very piano?
It is possible. It would have been later, after Mendelssohn's death, but it is possible.
Let's recreate it. As the royal couple revelled in their musical soirees with Mendelssohn, their friendship with him would be hugely influential. Sheet music was becoming more widely available thanks to cheaper printing, and affordable cottage pianos were being manufactured in the thousands. Now, everybody in Britain could play Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words in their own drawing rooms, just like the dear Queen and her husband. Making music with your family at home came to be seen as a virtuous thing to do. To be honest, for women who were supposed to be confined to the domestic sphere anyway, the home was the only place that they could make music. Professional female musicians were looked upon askance as being a bit like actresses. And as everybody knows, actresses are a bit dodgy. There was one woman, though, who'd begin to change this. She was a songbird from Sweden. At the beginning of the opera season in 1847, Victoria sat enthralled, though she and the whole audience swooned. The response to Jenny Lind, the Swedish nightingale, was almost hysterical. And the fact that the Queen was her most ardent admirer did wonders for Lind's reputation. Victoria developed such a huge crush on Jenny Lind that she went to see her 16 times. That's the whole of Lind's performances in one season. The Queen would even bunk off other responsibilities so as to hear the Nightingale sing. Once she broke up a big formal dinner at Buckingham Palace with the Prime Minister in order to get across town in time. The whole of the British public were caught up in this Lind mania, and Victoria was seen throwing flowers from the royal box and down onto the stage.
Lind gives me quite a shiver down my back, for which alone I would go to the opera.
Victoria was so obsessed with Jenny Lind that she showered her with gifts, including a delicate lace evening fan, a fine jewelled bracelet and brooch, a nightingale ornament, and even a lapdog from the royal kennels. Despite her slightly stalker-like behaviour, Victoria and Jenny Lind became quite friendly. And Lind showed the Queen something important about the enormous pull of celebrity. Victoria could see that if she could combine star appeal, like Lind had, with the ancient awe associated with the monarchy, perhaps she could win herself a new kind of power. Victoria wondered if she could win the hearts of her subjects, just as Jenny Lind had won the hearts of her audiences. Her emotional intelligence was changing the monarchy, but she also felt that she had to protect the established order. And I think you can see her deep conservatism in her choice of the first musician that she knighted. Henry R. Bishop was the composer of Home Sweet Home. This really was a lovely song, and practically anyone in Victorian Britain would have been able to hum you the tune. But if you look at the words of the song, it's all about the patriarchy and the status quo that was keeping Victoria herself on the throne. Ladies, stay at home is the message. You don't want any pleasures and palaces. Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home. It's a bit of a killer to ambition and to social mobility. This really is music as the opium of the masses. Maintaining the social order was more important than ever in 1848 as a series of revolutions swept across Europe. Middle classes and workers all over the continent were questioning the divine right of kings. If Britain's monarchy was to survive, it would have to keep the people on side. Victoria's clever husband devised the perfect PR coup. Albert commissioned the building of a temporary glass structure known as the Crystal Palace, just south of Hyde Park, to house a grand display of the very latest industry and technology. There were 100,000 inventions on display, from the latest musical instruments to steam-powered hammers. Here's an original souvenir model which shows off the magnificence of the event in miniature cardboard form. And the monarchy was front and centre. During the opening ceremony in the Crystal Palace, there was a huge choir of nearly 1,000 people all belting out the Hallelujah Chorus by Handel. Now, that wasn't necessarily Victoria's favourite composer, but nothing else said as clearly, "Hurrah for Prince Albert, long live the monarchy." The Great Exhibition is usually associated with industry and free trade. I'm meeting historian Andrew Wilson to find out how it also transformed music and the monarchy. This is a pretty spectacular advertisement for monarchy, isn't it?
It was pretty spectacular and musical advertisement for monarchy. And I mean, just look at this picture, Lucy. Look at the opening ceremony and how marvellous it was and how exciting it was. And at the very centre of it, Queen Victoria.
There she is on her throne. Do you think there was anything planned about presenting her in this very sort of modern, exciting mass-market environment?
Monarchy in this place was linked to economic liberalism, to free trade, and to what was going to become parliamentary democracy. It wasn't quite democracy yet. In a sense, the monarchy was one of the commodities that was on display in the Crystal Palace, alongside all the extraordinary new machines.
After the Great Exhibition, the enormous Crystal Palace was taken down and moved to a new permanent site in Sydenham, where it was used as a new music venue. Later on, the Crystal Palace itself got used for concerts. What significance did Albert attach to concerts?
Albert was a great pioneer of orchestral music in Britain, and the Crystal Palace, as you rightly say, was one of the first great orchestral concert venues in the south of England, certainly, but in Britain in general.
Did Albert have this idea that going to hear a concert would be good for you? It would make you morally, spiritually a better person?
Of course, and I mean, he's probably right, isn't he? But
makes it sound a bit dreary.
Moralism is always dreary, but certainly he did believe that music elevates us.
The industry celebrated at the Great Exhibition was being powered by the furnaces and mills of Great Britain. Many of the new instruments showcased, including the range of brass horns designed by Mr. Sax, guess who invented the saxophone, were now being cheaply manufactured in cities like Manchester. And this idea of Albert's, that music was somehow good for society, really caught on. Paternalistic factory owners, like John Foster of the Black Dyke Mill in Queensbury, Yorkshire, actively encouraged workers to make music. Not least because it was one way of keeping them out of the pub. This explosion of music brought something almost spiritual into the lives of people who were experiencing the harshness of the Industrial Revolution at first hand. The brass band became a symbol of the North, partly because it represented emotion to people in danger of being dehumanised by their jobs. It seems that the Victorians believed that music was good for you, and this idea was endorsed from the very top. As this kind of music became more accessible to larger swathes of the British public, the things people listened to also began to change. The repertoire of the brass band was self-consciously highbrow. They'd even play arias from operas, sometimes before their official London premieres. So someone in Yorkshire might have heard the latest work even before the Queen. But it wasn't just brass bands in the north. Thanks to yet another high-minded German, Manchester became home to one of Britain's most treasured orchestras. The conductor Charles Hallé arrived in the city in 1849, taking over the Gentlemen's Concerts. When he was asked to perform for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, he jumped at the chance. Hallé's concert went so well that he decided to keep his orchestra together. Every time they performed, he made sure that there were some cheap seats so that people could attend from all walks of life. Hallé even took his orchestra on tour around the north. Now more people than ever were sampling the finest European masters. But there still wasn't any British music on the menu. If you look at this programme from the first of Mr. Charles Hallé's grand orchestral concerts, you'll see that it's exactly the same sort of stuff that you might have found at one of Victoria and Albert's own state concerts. Here we've got Beethoven and Mendelssohn and Rossini. And the irony is that the person introducing this serious music to the industrial heartland of Britain is once again a German immigrant. You couldn't move for German composers on the concert scene in Britain. One in particular made a stir with London's Philharmonic Society in 1855. Mendelssohn had got rave reviews in the 40s, but the unknown and experimental Richard Wagner got a very different reaction. Wagner bombed spectacularly in London. The music critics couldn't understand what one of them called his wild and senseless dabbling. There was a bit of a sense that they didn't want to get behind yet another German composer, particularly one who was ripping up convention like this. Yet Victoria saw something in Wagner and publicly offered him her support when no one else would. She wouldn't let her musical tastes be dictated by an establishment growing ever more mistrustful of all things German. She loved her German husband. She had German blood herself. She'd even married off her eldest daughter, Vicky, to a Prussian prince. And above all, Victoria loved Wagner's music, writing to Vicky with envy at her having seen a performance of his romantic opera Lohengrin. The Queen herself was desperate to see it.
Pray send me what music is published of the new opera of Wagner. Lohengrin is my great favourite.
Wagner went back to Germany in a sulk. He was bitter about his experience in Britain. But he would be back 22 years later, by which time his music had become fashionable. Perhaps Victoria would get the chance to hear his Lohengrin, which intrigued her so much. But by then, Victoria herself would be an entirely different person. No longer could she be accused of having trivial tastes. Everything had changed for her. Not because of politics, but because of grief. In 1861, the unthinkable happened. Aged only 42, and in the prime of his life, Albert unexpectedly died of a mysterious fever. Devastated, Queen Victoria retreated from the public eye, and the rich concert life she and Albert had enjoyed ended forever. Music at court was silenced. It would be a long time before Victoria could write in her journal again. And when she finally picked up the pen, the depth of her sorrow was clear.
And now I am all alone, desolate and broken-hearted.
Victoria threw herself into memorialising Albert. On laying the foundation stone, the Queen named the building the Royal Albert Hall. This is an original architectural model. It really was a stunning bit of Victorian engineering. The model's only been recently rediscovered in pieces. In a cupboard, it's been put back together again for us. It looks like there was a hole in the middle of it, so you could poke your head up and you could get a 360 panorama of what it was going to be like inside. The model also shows a flaw in the design. This glass roof, this turned out to be terrible from the acoustic point of view, and they had to put up a massive piece of canvas to deaden down the echo. And here is Queen Victoria at the opening ceremony in 1871 of this massive musical memorial to Albert. She's the very picture of despair. To Victoria, Albert and music had become so poignantly intertwined in her mind that it would be years before she could take pleasure in music again. Alongside this spectacular concert venue, a new school of music was erected in Albert's honour. The Royal College of Music was built to develop a new generation of British composers. From Victoria's great loss, the seeds for a new national music were being sown. With the passage of time, Victoria gradually reintroduced music into her private life. She found it painfully emotional.
It is only quite lately that I have reopened my music books, and the past seemed to rush in upon me, in a strange and marvellous manner. It made me sad, particularly the Beethoven and Mendelssohn pieces, which my beloved Albert loved so much, and we used to play together. We seemed somehow to be together again, in spirit.
Victoria was forever changed by Albert's death. An outward sign of Victoria's monumental loss was her adoption of formal black mourning. But I do believe that this later period was the making of Queen Victoria. This is a very rare thing. It's a bodice from the sort of costume that she adopted for the rest of her life. This one is from the 1870s, perhaps when she's just starting to emerge from the worst of her grief. It's decorated with crepe, this dull material that symbolises bereavement. And there's also an unexpected reason why it made sense for Victoria always to wear black. In modern terms, it was the most fantastic visual branding. Her subjects knew exactly what Queen Victoria looked like, because she always looked exactly the same. As Victoria emerged as a magisterial matriarch in black, her cunning Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, deployed her new image to Britain's advantage. In 1876, he named Victoria Empress of India, and she was thrilled, recording the moment fondly in her diary.
I have for the first time today signed myself as V.R. and I.
But India was an awfully long way away. To your average Victorian, it was almost a mythical place. How could they be expected to care about it when life was already pretty tough at home? Well, there was one way of whipping people up so that they'd be willing to serve and even to die in the service of the empire. And that was the music hall, where political messages could be hidden inside insanely catchy choruses.
We've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. We fought the bear before.
This was the first in a wave of popular imperialist songs. It even introduced a new word into the English language.
Don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do.
It's technically about our rivalry with Russia, but the song's aggressive patriotism made it a timeless rallying cry for British imperialism.
While we're Britain's true, the Russians shall not have Constantinople.
Popular support for imperialism was being whipped up in the music hall as the British Empire expanded and seized ever more land and resources. But it was India that was the jewel in the crown. This vast country was a source of great wealth to Britain. And in her old age, Victoria became obsessed with India, just like she had with Scotland in her youth. She built this sensational room at her summer home, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, in the Indian style, and immersed herself in the country's culture and music. Victoria's Indian subjects also presented her with gifts, including musical odes, like The Greatness of the Empress Victoria by Surendra Mohan Tagore. Tagore presented this music to Victoria as if it were ancient, but really it's a strange fusion. It even has Western notation. Queen Victoria was clearly intrigued by India, wasn't she? What do you think she was up to there? Was she creating the cult of an empress, or was she personally interested, or a little bit of both?
I imagine a bit of both. I think it is very moving to look at some of the objects that are collected from that period when she was really investing herself in Indian culture and language. When you look through her handwritten vocab books where she's listing phrases in Hindustani, which she's been learning, when she's practicing handwriting in Urdu, you can see a very personal investment in it.
I have a sort of image of a little old lady who doesn't understand but wants to understand and is trying to express something benign. But also I'm thinking, wow, you don't really know what your troops are up to over there, do you? I find it troubling.
It's a very difficult thing to reflect on. I think even with these songs, on the one hand, you can see it as a great innovation. You can also see it as a monument to her role as empress. But also it does, in effect, hide the damaging consequences of empire and colonialism on Indian music.
This song by Tagore was written for Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, which marks the high point of her reign and the peak of her empire. But it also marked the moment when the political influence of the monarchy had all but disappeared. Victoria's power was by now decorative and ceremonial, but that's not to say it wasn't still formidable. Victoria was using music and ceremony and spectacle to create a whole new way of being a monarch. It all came together, as this old film shows, in her Diamond Jubilee of 1897. This was really the world's first global multimedia event, and it also set the template for pretty much all the grand royal occasions that would follow. Victoria's subjects came flooding into London to see this little old lady being paraded through the streets. She really did look very ordinary, just like somebody's grandmother. But that was the clever thing. She was presenting herself as the friendly face of this vast empire, which had used violence to win control over nearly a quarter of the population of the globe.
The cheering was quite deafening, and every face seemed to be filled with real joy. I was much moved and gratified.
The parade was impressive, but so too was another part of the Diamond Jubilee celebrations, the debut at the Royal Albert Hall of a new composition by an English composer. Edward Elgar's Imperial March was music fit for a queen and an empress. Written for a monarch whose unwavering belief in the power of music had supported her for all 60 years of her reign. Elgar's magisterial compositions would become the new sound of Britain. And soon the Royal College of Music would also bear fruit, producing a new generation of composers to follow in his footsteps. All thanks to Victoria and Albert, whose great love had paved the way for the next century of British music. But this isn't quite the end of our story. 2 years after her Jubilee, Victoria celebrated her 80th birthday. And of course the occasion was marked with music. But this time, there wasn't any pomp and circumstance. That evening, there was a private performance in this very room. And this one, I think, stands for her intimate, personal connection with music. In the 1890s, the Waterloo Chamber at Windsor Castle had become Victoria's very own private opera house. Here, in 1899, she gathered around with her family to watch a special performance of Richard Wagner's Lohengrin. Finally, Victoria got to hear the opera she'd been longing to hear for years. But it was bittersweet. She was so moved by the power and intensity of Wagner's music that just as she'd done throughout her life, she reflected upon it in her journal.
I was simply enchanted. It is the most glorious composition, so poetic, so dramatic, and one might almost say religious in feeling, full of sadness and pathos and tenderness.
What she wrote revealed what music really meant to Queen Victoria. To her, it was emotion, enchantment. Music was like the blood that flowed through her veins, blood that was British, but also deeply German. And she couldn't know it, but in 15 years, the blood of those two nations, Britain and Germany, would once again mingle on the battlefield. And that the composer who inspired this religious feeling would later become synonymous with much darker forces. The sadness and the drama of Victoria's beloved Wagner would describe the century to come. This rupture between two nations so dear to Victoria would have broken her heart and changed the world in ways she could never have imagined. But the legacy of her uniquely musical life would survive and create something truly enduring in British music. And I find it comforting to think of this aging empress, so near the end of her life, blissfully unaware of the storm clouds brewing, enjoying the music simply for what it was.